So 42 minutes doesn't really seem like a long time. It's about the amount of time I spend cooking dinner, if I ever cook. It's about the amount of time I can last on a treadmill. It's about the amount of time I leave myself at the airport, which is probably cutting it a little bit too close. If you let yourself just think about it for a second, what might you be able to accomplish in just 42 minutes? For me, 42 minutes set my life and my twin brother Brandon's life on completely divergent trajectories. Despite an entirely healthy pregnancy, a doctor's mistake during our birth resulted in his lifelong diagnosis of cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is a disorder that comes in all shapes and sizes. For some individuals, it affects the movement of a single limb, like the arm or a leg. It might affect just half of the body, like the upper body or the lower body. But in the most severe cases, like my brother Brandon's, cerebral palsy took control of his entire body. What puzzled people the most was that Brandon was all there intellectually, a brain trapped in a body he could not control. He had 7 or 8 nurses rotating in and out of our house 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists. As I learned to walk, to talk, and to eat, Brandon did not. You see, as his twin, I was young. I didn't know any better until I went to elementary school. I remember showing up and there was a set of twins in my class, Ross and Lizzie Weintraub. I remember thinking to myself, where was my twin? Why wasn't Brandon here too? It turns out that Brandon went to a different school for children like him with physical disabilities. At that point in time, it felt like the only thing we had in common was our birthday. I started to become increasingly curious about cerebral palsy. I remember when the internet first came out. Do you remember Ask Jeeves? I asked Jeeves, how long do people live with cerebral palsy? What I came to learn from a very young age, that Brandon's life was likely going to be shorter than my own. So I did what any child might do in that situation. Every year on our birthday, we'd sit in front of the cake. I'd close my eyes and wish in my head a long, happy life for Brandon, and blow out the candles. And that wish was coming true. Brandon lived a happy life. He learned to communicate using a device known as a Dynavox, but his preference was to communicate with his eyes and his head that he could control. He'd look left for yes and right for no. One of our favorite games growing up was something we called Glop. I'd wheel Brandon's chair in front of the refrigerator and just watched where his eyes went. He'd stare at the ketchup. I'd take it out and I'd put it in a bowl. He'd look at pickles, eggs, soy sauce, you name it. We'd just throw it in the bowl. You're probably wondering, like, what did you do with this? Sometimes we'd throw it out, but to really make Brandon laugh hysterically, we'd offer it up to his nurses to eat. It became my lifelong mission to bring a smile to Brandon's face whenever possible. And these experiences brought a smile to my face too. But I've had trouble acknowledging and admitting that it wasn't always easy. Although I was the twin born first, it felt that my needs always came second. I did my best to stay the course, to get good grades, to not give my parents anything additional to stress about. My problems felt so small in comparison to Brandon's. Full-time nurses, unlimited doctor's appointments, trips back and forth to the hospital, and surgeries. How does this compare to not making varsity soccer or feeling left out from my friends? I never wanted to ruffle my parents' feathers or give them anything additional to stress about. So I went to my older sister, Holly. She became my go-to person. When the time came to start to think about college, I remember just floating the idea with my mom. How about schools in California? USC? A couple weeks later, she scheduled a visit at the University of Pennsylvania, which was just a couple hours away from our home. It was clear there was this unspoken expectation that I would be living close to home throughout college. I didn't even fathom studying abroad. When it came time to look for a job, it was as if there was this invisible string pulling me back to be at home with Brandon and my family. In our 20s, I started to notice a shift in Brandon. You could just tell, looking at him, despite the level of love and support, his body was beginning to win the fight against him. Brandon didn't always feel like getting out of his bed anymore. So instead, when I came home, I would jump into bed with him and curl up next to him, doing my best to transfer the smile on my face to his. Family dinners in the kitchen were no longer a thing. My parents literally brought a new table and chairs to use in Brandon's room so that he could be part of the family dinner too. With this shift in Brandon came a shift in my birthday wish too. I'd close my eyes and think in my head, a long, happy life for Brandon, but without any suffering. It's clear over the past 28 years, I've suffered my own version of survivor's guilt. 42 minutes. It's not lost on me that I could have been the twin delivered second. I could have been the one with cerebral palsy. Why wasn't I the one with cerebral palsy? What if it was me? Suddenly, 42 minutes feels like an entire lifetime. On January 26, 2016, I got the dreaded phone call, 2017. I got the dreaded phone call from my mom. Brandon had not woken up that morning. I was all the way in London on a work trip, ironically, for someone who tried not to venture too far from home, for someone who came into the world with Brandon. I was physically the furthest away. That moment, you can imagine, has haunted me my entire life, and yet I felt completely unprepared. It felt so sudden. Stupidly, the best example I can share is it's like that moment at the end of an exam when you're rushing to finish and the professor calls time, pencils down. There's no more time to change your answers. There's no additional time to tell Brandon how much I love him, how much he has impacted me, how proud I was to be his sister, how proud I was of him. Pencils down. On that 18-hour journey home from London, that was my first step into this new reality. Like cerebral palsy, loss and death and grief come in all shapes and sizes. But unlike cerebral palsy, this is not something you can always see with the human eye. For me, losing Brandon consumed my entire being. I had spent 27 years being defined by being Brandon's twin sister. Every decision I had made to that point was with Brandon in mind. And despite the challenges and the difficulties that came with the territory of being Brandon's twin sister, I consider myself so lucky. While this story is about me, it's really about Brandon. I am who I am today because of Brandon. I thought with Brandon's death, parts of me would die too, but they haven't entirely. I carry Brandon's gifts and lessons with me wherever I go. In life, Brandon taught me to appreciate the simple things, like making glop. He taught me to celebrate our differences, to adapt, to play the cards you're dealt. In death, Brandon has taught me to really just savor the moments with people you love the most and don't take a second for granted. In life and in death, it is because of Brandon that I live my life for too. So last year, when it came time to spend my first birthday alone, I sat in front of my cake and gave myself permission to grant 2 wishes. I wished in my head that my brother Brandon is at peace and without any suffering, and I wish what I know my brother would wish for me, and that's a long and happy life for Tracy. Thank you.